Okay, welcome everybody to the latest edition of Ed Talks. Thank you for listening in. The most convenient way for you to listen normally, and the way we hear most of our listeners listen in, is commuting. So hopefully it'll be a good. Hopefully this will help speed your commute through. I've had some interesting guests, but for anybody who is in the property industry, this is probably one of the most interesting we've had to date, and probably someone who, if this was a phone in, we'd probably have some jammed lines. I'm very pleased to have Kevin Hollinrake, MP for Thirsk and Malton, and also chairman of Hunters. So a rare thing in Parliament to have someone who understands about property, business, and an MP. So it's a good combination. So welcome, Kevin.
Thanks,
for coming
Ed.
in.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, we've met a few times before, but a lot of people out there will know who you are, but not probably what you are. And actually, as well as being an MP, you also retain the chairmanship of Hunters, which is a 200-branch, partly owned, partly franchised company that I think is now all over the UK. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. It started in 1992, single office in York, and built it from there, really. And iterative process. We were always ambitious. I wanted to build a big network, and so moved into the world of franchising in 2005, and that gave us a supercharged our growth.
And it's something of a family outfit, isn't it?
Yeah, kind of. Myself and a guy called John Waterhouse started it back in 1992. Then Keith, my brother, joined us in 1994, and Glynis probably a couple of years later. And Glynis now is chief exec. So yeah, and I think beyond the kind of blood relative family as well, we're a very family feel of business, despite the fact that we're a much bigger business. Big believer in small business. That's where I started, and where I started, and. So we have a franchise network. Of the 200 offices, 190 are franchised. So it's really providing support structures for SMEs, and great to have the opportunity to mentor those kind of people.
So how did you start? I mean, obviously, certainly back in our day, not a lot of people started out wanting to be estate agents. They started out wanting to be something else, and then they didn't necessarily do what they wanted to do, and then they became estate agents.
Yes.
And if you were good at it, it was a really fantastic job. So can I ask what you did want to do originally, and how you came into it?
Somebody said that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. Well, I think some people could say that about estate agents. You kind of fall into it because of things. Probably a lot of people that I did because other things hadn't worked out. I studied physics at Poly, which was then Sheffield Poly, and didn't do particularly well at that. And then I started one or two little small businesses, and I was too lazy and ill-disciplined at that time. So they went up for 2 or 3 years, and then I think my dad said, "By the time you got a job, son," and I applied for a job as a trainee estate agent and a trainee valuer for a small independent in York. 4 months later, and I got the job, and 4 months later, the valuer left, and I became the valuer of these 4 offices, and I kind of learnt as I went. Made loads of mistakes along the way, but great learning curve.
Not much has changed really since, has it? I mean, the industry is still, because it's a people business, it's still much the same now as it was then. The way people learn about valuing, they have to get on the job and be mentored by someone. It's much the same, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we didn't have proper training programs back then. You know, when I started our business, it was, there's the phone, can I get on with it? You train people on the job. But it's brilliant fun. I mean, I've loved every minute of it. It's such a competitive business, which I love. And that's what competition is, what drives down prices and drives up service for consumers. And you won't find a more competitive sector than this. Whatever the politicians might say, this is, we offer, I believe, in the UK, a fantastic service of very little money relative to other countries on the basis the market is so competitive. But anybody who's driven, ambitious, wants to earn a decent amount of money and have a very rewarding career, I think, providing service for people in need who want to move house at a stressful time can be very rewarding if you do the job right and are successful.
Yeah. I mean, I always used to think that politicians needed to take a bit more of a grip on the qualifications standards of people who are getting into our industry. And obviously that's been something which has been mooted of late under Richard Best's chairmanship, this registration of property agents, which we've spoken about briefly. And I'm aware that you have a slightly differing view on the way forward. I always felt that politicians were happy to sort of leave it at arm's length because it was cheap and it seemed to sort of self-regulate the market. But I think that it's become such a bone of contention, particularly in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, where a lot of the online agents have supposedly driven fees down even further, and service standards have been perceived as perhaps as falling, which is not what you would have wanted. If you've got self-regulation, you'd expect it to be getting better and better and better. So, do you think that's why someone stepped in, and are they doing the right thing?
Yes, it's right they stepped in. I mean, we agree that we need to raise standards in the sector. There's no doubt about it. Do I think the proposals as they are set out at the moment in terms of the ROPA proposals right? No, I don't. Because I think regulation, consumers always pay for regulation. One way or the other, it always ends up with the consumer. When they started down this road of regulating the sector, they used two different jurisdictions as an example. One was the USA and one was Denmark. USA, they charge 6% to sell a house. Denmark, they charge 3%. We typically charge probably 1.25 here on average across the nation. So we are, as you say, a very competitive market which kind of self-regulates. I don't think you can leave it to self-regulation entirely, but I think there's a better way than somebody coming through checking our business's employment files to make everybody's got the right qualification and they're all kind of fully kind of qualification dope, if I can put it that way. I think that's a huge bureaucracy that lots of people make money out of, particularly the people providing the training and the qualifications and the certifications, all those stuff. All that cost will be borne by the consumers. So competition will reduce, fees will go up. Now, in my position as a kind of chairman of a 200 office network, you could say that's great, and I think it would be great for our business because we do the job right. It would drive out a lot of people who don't do the job right, but lots of people wouldn't enter the market too because of that bureaucracy, not because they couldn't be good estate agents or good letting agents.
Yeah, that's a good point. So
I would much rather see a beefed up ombudsman. So if we're with a code of conduct. So if an agent, a letting agent, sales agent, whatever, as we have today in the market already, if you step out of line, the customer can take a complaint to the ombudsman and get settlement that way. It's a much more efficient, effective way to do it rather than having thousands of regulators.
But there's quite a heavy code of conduct already that the ombudsman has put in place.
And I've seen nothing within the proposals of ROPA that couldn't be dealt with by a super ombudsman. One ombudsman, much with a greater jurisdiction and oversight, and a bit tougher, but also working more closely with local authorities to ban agents from the sector, but not just agents. The other difficulty with the ROPA proposals, they don't cover landlords. So in lettings terms, you're covering half the market.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
I mean, coming back to the issue of beefing up the ombudsman's role. Obviously, the ombudsman isn't a regulator. She, at the moment, is just there to make awards against people who have misbehaved in some way or another, or are proved to have misbehaved. Surely, if you want to then beef up that role, there are so many other things. When the ombudsman makes a banning order against an estate agent, part of the problem is that these guys then they phoenix, they go into liquidation and they pop up somewhere else. There's still the regulation element of that. That still has to be policed. You still have to have people checking up on this. And part of the problem has always been, surely, of this, that it's never been resourced properly. So it doesn't matter whether you have a huge bureaucracy that's going to enforce regulation, or you're still going to need a bureaucracy to follow up on all these banning orders and fines, make sure they're paid and all that sort of thing. So isn't it 6 of one and a half dozen of the other a little bit?
Well, can I give you an analogy? The sector that's most regulated in the UK is the financial services sector. We have the FCA, 3,700 people, and they go. Anybody who's had a mortgage business attached to their business, like I have, I was an approved person at one point, knows all the kind of jumps, all the hoops you got to jump through, and the kind of boxes you got to tick. Is financial services perfectly regulated? Do we ever see abuse in financial services? Huge amount. Swaps, mis-selling scandals, PPI scandals, SME mistreatment. one after another. Regulators after the event. A much better way to regulate, look at employment law. There is no employment regulator. There are employment regulations. So you know as an employer, two things. You treat your staff well for two reasons. Number one, you believe you're a decent person and you want to treat your staff well because you know you get the best out of them that way. But also, you know, if you get it wrong, you're going to end up in an employment tribunal because the employer can't stop somebody going to a tribunal because there's no adverse costs. So you'd have to stand the other side's costs, even if you lose, which gives the individual the opportunity to then really hold the employer to account. And that's a much better way. It's what we should do in financial services, with a financial services tribunal, which is something I campaign for in Parliament. But also, it's a much better way to make sure agents, letting agents, sales agents, and landlords all should have to be members of a redress scheme. When things go wrong, people know where they can go to. It's one place they go to. They go to the ombudsman, who can find against the business concerned, and they could fine them heavily through the trading standards connection, and they can ban them from the sector.
So one assumes that rather than the 200 odd quid per office that people pay at the moment to be a member of the TPO, the Property Ombudsman Scheme, that would presumably go up. It would have to, wouldn't it?
Possibly, because it'd take on more of a role. But having said that, you've got a lot more landlords feeding into the Ombudsman, so the economies of scale are better. You also have one scheme, not three, so that, again, the economies of scale are better. But if you go down the regulation, £200 an office is going to be a lot more than that. Yeah. You're going to be £200 a person, aren't you? Because you got the company and the person. So all these costs are going to feed in.
But what do you think's driven this, Kevin? Because obviously 10 years ago, things seemed to sort of work pretty much okay. And there wasn't the push for regulation. And there were always people saying, oh, we should be regulated. And actually, partly that was from people, not like me necessarily, but people who felt that the standards in the industry could always be higher because there was no bar to entry. What is it that's suddenly driven this desire to regulate? Because it seemed to work okay some time ago.
Do you remember when they brought in HIPS and that was supposed to tackle gazumping? And it didn't do any of the sort. We all knew that. They started off trying, let's tackle gazumping because it was an issue at the time because the property market was going crazy. So they brought in HIPS, which tackle a completely different problem, which is the timescales of the transaction. So, and I think it's the same as this. They brought this in because of rogue landlords. And we get here in Parliament all the time, oh my God, the standard of private sector rented accommodation in the UK is terrible. All these landlords, they're all just ripping the tenants off. You and I know, no, that's not the case. It's a hugely competitive market.
Which mostly, vast majority works fine.
Absolutely. Where landlords, if you look at the flat I rent in London, a landlord must be on about 2 or 3% yield. Tiny return. So you've got this very competitive market, but lots of good landlords. Now, what the politicians do, of course, they grab onto a bad case or a number of bad cases or a proportion of landlords who are bad and say, this is terrible. What we need to do is regulate, because that's what Parliament does. And they go and then they set on this road. And, of course, the road they've gone down is not even going to tackle the rogue landlords.
And the trouble is, once they start, they can't really sort of stop. I mean, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I'm not in disagreement. Having sat on the board of the Property Ombudsman myself for a very long time, I think that a beefed-up role for the Ombudsman has a lot. But, of course, in employment law, you know that if you mess up, you're going to be in trouble because there's the whole weight of the law behind it, and you'll get clobbered, which is why people now take it seriously and are very compliant with that. I think that would be some way away. I'm delighted to see the whole thing under the microscope, but it'll be interesting because there aren't many people with your ability to talk about it like that. So, do you think you have any chance of swaying the way things are?
I think it's going to be tough because, as I say, the government's kind of committed itself and gone down this route. But we've had a change of leadership in the country since a change of prime minister since this was first introduced. So I think there's a good chance we can get them to stop and just think. Because back to the key thing, the key thing is the current proposals do not even regulate landlords. And we know that's where the majority of problems lie. Landlords who let direct. So it's just not the rules are just not fit for purpose. I'm not against regulations. I'm against the way we regulate. Having a regulator which is very expensive and messy.
Well, if we have a change of government again, maybe our mutual friend Peter Rawlings, who tweeted yesterday that you should be the next Secretary of State for Housing, Esther McVeigh, I think the current incumbent, would probably have an argument about that. But nevertheless,
Yes.
Who knows? As we said earlier, and I think everyone listening would concur that it would be fabulous to have someone who understands the industry getting a bit closer to housing policy. I mean, one of the things that didn't come out yesterday in the Queen's speech, we were talking briefly before this, Kevin, about how it wasn't a farce. Unfortunately, that's the way the country works with the opening of Parliament and the Queen's speech. But personally, I was disappointed not to see anything in there about stamp duty. I do feel that stamp duty has been, I think in London, people misunderstand the market. They misunderstand that if people always dismiss people who buy very rich properties as not, they don't care. Look, that's a tiny little bit of the market. It doesn't matter. But London is a very aspirational market. People, someone who's living in Wandsworth doesn't buy a house in Chelsea because they need a bigger house. They buy it because they want to live in Chelsea. If they don't buy the house in Chelsea, the whole chain collapses further down. It's a very unusual market. I don't know. Is there ever any discussion about stamp duty, or is that not something?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I've been in the sector now for probably 32 years, and stamp duty has been a bone of contention all those 32 years. And I think most people concede we had it wrong before. It was this slab tax that created distortions at 250 and at 500, and the idea was to get rid of those slabs and smooth it out. And it's worked pretty successfully up to £1 million because everybody's better off. Is when you get over £1 million, and which affects London particularly. It doesn't affect Yorkshire all that much, but to some extent it does. But over that point in time, it's causing real problems in the market. Problems that are connected to other things, like Brexit, of course. So it's difficult to see how much of the reduction in transactions over £1 million are to do with stamp duty and how much to do with Brexit. I think there's definitely an argument for looking at trying to make sure that the stamp duty levels above £1 million are lower than they are today. They are prohibitively high, and that's not good for the economy. You mentioned before about the government goes down a certain track. How does it get back? The difficulty is if you stood up in the House of Commons now at Budget Day and said, actually, we're going to cut stamp duty for really wealthy people, that's not going to go down well, and especially with a hung Parliament, which we are today. So I think it's unlikely to change before an election, I would think. I think Boris Johnson did talk about some reform here. One of the things that's been mooted is to switch the tax stamp duty from the purchaser to the seller. I think it's a massive mistake. You're taxing supply, and the number one thing that's wrong with the housing market is supply. It doesn't affect the equation, actually, the reality.
And it's actually the same thing anyway. It doesn't matter. It still comes out of the
absolutely. It's just
transaction.
And causes all kinds of complications.
I suppose sometimes we need to be aware that in a lot of other countries, you go to the States, and of course you have, state taxes, federal taxes, totally. You have local taxes, people pay. You have a house in California, you pay 1/3% of the value of the house every year. People forget that sometimes the system here is simple. It is relatively simple. It's also slightly ironic that back in whenever it was, 97 or whenever it was, that it was Ken Clarke, I think, who started the rise of stamp duty or taking it out of the simple 1% catch-all. Yeah. I just think that if Sajid Javid stood up in Parliament and said, we're going to reduce stamp duty, rather than and then backed it up by saying because it's going to create an awful lot more work for people in that arena in London. There's a guy called James Pickford at the FT who did a big piece about 3 or 4 years ago about how much money people spend when they buy big houses in London. And they spend a fortune, millions of pounds over a number of years, because they employ lots of people to do things to the house and to run it and that is all disappearing. And I'm not completely sure I agree about the Brexit. I think a lot of people who own big houses, yes, there probably is an element of the Brexit thing in it, but most people, I think the stamp duty has had a much larger effect for people, and now that share of the stamp duty take is going down, perhaps politicians will start, or the Treasury will start looking. Well, hang on a minute, if it's going down, we need to do something about it, and I think that would be interesting. Okay, another quick subject, which is very interesting. I put out a thing on Twitter yesterday asking people for questions about saying, is there anything people want to ask Kevin? And a very combative estate agent in Yorkshire, who you may or may not know, a guy called David Leake, put a thing out about fracking, saying, what do you think about fracking? Yes. From what I read over the last few days, it seems like they're packing up and going home. But he was worrying about what effect fracking has on local communities. Sure. Yeah, I understand that. I mean, before I stood to be a candidate in 2014,
I'd never heard the word fracking, actually, and somebody mentioned it to me, and I don't think I've had a frack-free day since, actually. I mean, it's been, because my whole constituency, the place I've lived all my life, is the whole thing is covered by fracking licences. So, and I'm supportive of fracking, because we need gas. Under any scenario, energy scenario, for the next 2-3 decades, we'll be using more gas. We're phasing out coal by 2025 completely. Lots of renewables as well, of course, but we need gas. So we've got a simple choice: is do we produce it here or do we import it? And it's, for the environment, it's better to produce it, and for the economy, it's better to produce it. So can we do it in a way that Mr. Leake has said, people have concerns about industrialisation? Well, I would say this, in my patch, beautiful Rydales, you've been there, it's an absolutely gorgeous place. There are 9 conventional well pads there, been there for 30 years. So not fracked pads, well, they do frack conventional pads, actually, conventional wells, but they've been there for 30 years. I didn't know they even were there before I became the MP, so somebody told me they were there. So because the mature pads in mature locations with trees around, you don't even see them. So yes, there's an industrial part of the process while the well's been drilled and fracked, and there is some disturbance there for local people, and there should be some compensation for local people for that. But when the fracking's happened, if it's well managed and well planned, I don't see a massive impact on local communities, and I do see potential for jobs being created and for revenue to go in people's pockets locally from the gas that's produced from those.
It does seem, from what you read over the last few days, like they are sort of packing up and going home.
Yeah,
Quadrilla were talking about getting out.
I think that's where we are. I think it's very controversial. People are worried about climate change. People are worried about house prices. There's an NIMBYs part of this as well, of course, and anything like this. And so for various reasons, and seismicity, of course, which is the biggest issue in the northwest. So it looks very unlikely, I think, that fracking will be rolled.
Well, it was interesting, isn't it? The press was reporting, I think, last week that for the first time in history, in the last 3 months, I think more energy was produced by renewables than it was by fossil fuels.
Great to see.
So I'm always slightly amazed by a country, and it sounds like the person who's going to benefit most from this is the aforementioned Queen, because she owns the rights to anything, any of the land within, I've forgotten what, anything under the sea. I can't remember what the distance is, but for a country like ours, which is surrounded by waves, there must be some way of harnessing that a bit better. But,
I think wind and solar are the big two massive opportunities. We've just commissioned offshore wind off the east coast of Yorkshire, actually, and that'll produce a huge amount of electricity without subsidy. So that's definitely the future. The difficulty with wind and solar, it's intermittent. So it's great if the sun's shining and the wind's blowing.
But you need
you need something to get the base load, which is gas and nuclear.
Yes, I can't believe there isn't going to be some way of being able to store huge amounts of that electricity that's produced to then let it back into the grid when it needs. So,
battery technology is on its way.
Is definitely improving. Now, one of the things which I know we've spoken about before is not so much house prices, but the ability of people to be able to afford the sort of house they need to live in. So we're talking about, policemen, nurses. I remember in the old days when I first started in working in central London. For instance, in South Kensington, there were whole streets which were given over to nurses' accommodation that worked in the Marsden and some of the other hospitals. And it was just a part of daily life. This was off Onslow Square, now some of the most expensive real estate in the world, probably. And of course, the people who owned that suddenly twigged what was going on and decided to sell it off. This was in the sort of early 80s. And the same thing was going on back in those days with Margaret Thatcher and the council council housing stock was being sold off. And I think the unintended consequence of that is that an awful lot of that housing, I've forgotten what the figures are, but it's something like 30 or 40% ended up in the hands of large landlords who then put it into the private rented sector. What do you think? I mean, and it's very clear that affordable housing has never been replaced. I think the intention was always there to do that, but it never materialised. So what a trite question, it's not meant to be at all, but what is the answer to it? What's your take on it?
Well, there's two key things. The first thing I'd say, the private rented sector cannot provide a solution for affordable homes. That's not what it's there for. Private landlords are not there for that. So government's got to step in, spend a lot more money on building truly affordable homes. The National Housing Federation, which is the representative body of the housing associations say for 12.8 billion quid a year they can build 137,000 truly affordable homes. So not 80% market value is called affordable, but truly social housing, a lot of social housing, and 50% market value, which is what you need to do. So the government's going to invest more. It's an upfront cost. There'll be a long-term payback over 30 years because you're reducing the amount of money you're spending on housing benefit. We spend about 23 billion a year on housing benefit at the moment. So that's the strategic solution to high house prices for people on low incomes. There are 3.6 million people who live in the UK today who are in poverty purely as a result of housing costs. So we need to deal with that. And the only way we can deal with that is government stepping in. In terms of people getting on the housing market, so there's also the other crisis we're seeing is a crisis of owner occupation. So owner occupation in the UK peaked at 69% in 2003. It's now down to 61%. And some people say, well, let's be like the continent. Let's be like the continent. Let's all rent. I think that's a terrible idea. Besides which, the continent's not like that. We're the fourth lowest in the EU for owner occupation in terms of penetration, number of people who own their own home. So that's the wrong way forward. So we've got to make houses more affordable so young people can get onto the housing ladder. It's not for you can't have capitalism if people can't access capital, and you do that principally most people through the housing market. So the government solution to this is right. Okay, we'll build 300,000 homes a year, and that'll bring houses prices down, and therefore people get on the housing ladder. That won't happen. You'll get moderation probably in terms of growth to some extent, but the housing market works on different factors than simply supply. Because there's such an undersupply, it would take years, decades.
And there's a very heavy availability of credit at very low interest rates.
That's right, exactly right. And so people will borrow more than perhaps they should do. And besides which, if you look at in the southeast, London, the southeast, parts of it you've got a average earnings to affordability ratio to house price ratio of about 14. Well, even if you built enough houses to drop house prices by 20%, which I think would be a really bad thing, particularly a bad thing for people who just bought last year. So that wouldn't be very desirable, and those things are normally connected to an economic recession anyway. Even then, it's still going to be unaffordable at 10 times earnings. So you need to do something else. And what we can do is something very, very simple, is at the moment, most affordable homes are delivered through Section 106 agreements, about 25,000 homes a year. Developer comes along, builds 100 houses, 30 of them have got to be set aside as affordable homes. They're sold to a housing association. They're sold to a housing association at 50% market value typically. Housing association comes along and rents that property out at 80% market value. Why don't we just sell it to young first-time buyers on low incomes at 50% market value? And it would be kept on at 50% market value in perpetuity. So you haven't got that right to buy kind of sell-offs that people walk away with a big pile of cash. You sell it to the next person at 50% market value. It's called discount market sale. It's provisioned within the MPPF already. We could do it, just that we're not doing it. And I've been banging on to the government. Rob Jenrick's great. I think he's going to roll out the policy. Who's the Housing Secretary, Esther McVeigh, who's the Housing Minister. I think they really are keen to deliver this. But we could deliver tens of thousands of homes, half-price homes, for young people on lower incomes that would set the clock back in terms of your chances of getting on the housing ladder 20 years at least. And we could also do the same on public land. So public land, MOD bases, NHS property they no longer need. At the moment, this ridiculous requirement that the Treasury has, you've got to get best value for that, which means flogging it to a developer who's going to then deliver lots of big expensive houses on it and a few Section 106 cheaper stuff. Let's commission the bill directly and build those of half-price homes.
Yes, I don't understand. I'm aware from my own experience that some of the NHS and MOD land, particularly NHS land, there's often a problem with saying, "Oh, we might build a hospital on it at some point in the future." You know, that can often be a big issue.
Sure.
So, do you think that? I mean, I agree with a lot of that, and I think the comment you made about housing associations is interesting because I think that I think a lot of people imagine that housing associations are just providing low-cost accommodation for people, when, of course, a lot of them now only exist because they have great big commercial operations. In fact, they're 90%, a lot of them, commercial operations,
right,
to fund the little bit that does the good work or whatever, the affordable stuff. And one might argue that if you take away some of that stuff, which is the sort of the implied 30% margin, sell them at 50%, they rent at 80% of value, that might then alter their business model, which might just turn them into developers. But that's probably the argument you'll get from housing associations. But I think...
Yeah, but I agree with that. And they want to see the Section 106 stuff coming through. Nobody's saying they all have to be discount market sale, half-price homes. So you have a balance of the two. But I think there'd be, as long as they're getting the 12.8 billion a year, which is investment, then they can invest in buying land and providing more, you're right, fewer market price homes and more affordable homes to rent and to purchase, which is, I think, is a trick we're missing. So it's a balance. Housing associations do a great job by and large. As you say, they don't just provide housing also. They provide lots of services to people in need who live in those houses in terms of employment support and lots of good things. So I have lots of time for them. But nevertheless, if you can imagine a young first-time buyer on low incomes who can't buy a house is forced with a single option of renting something. If you could say to that person, it's the same house, actually, instead of you renting it at 80% market value, it's cheaper for you to buy at 50% market value. Which one do you want to do?
Yeah, I mean, I guess provided I rather blithely said earlier that there's great credit availability at the moment, and actually, of course, there isn't. Ostensibly, it's easy to get a mortgage, but actually, the rules have come back a little bit from MMR. They're not quite as draconian as they used to be, but they're still pretty heavy. Mm-hmm. And of course, the tests these days being applied are that you can you afford your mortgage if interest rates go up 3%, 4%, 5%, whatever it is. Yeah. Personally, I've been saying for 10 years that interest rates won't go up for ages and ages and ages. Ever since it first started, it's very clear that. And people forget the reason we've got low interest rates is because the sort of global setup is not in a great way. You wouldn't have interest rates at 0.5% if the economy was normal. Yeah. But I don't think that's going to change for a very long time. So I really agree with you. I think we're missing a trick big time. We could be borrowing a lot of money to do this infrastructure. Definitely. Instead of spending the 23 billion on housing benefit, that could go into a much more... Some of it, anyway, could go into a much more efficient use of that money and building houses. And of course, some of it's supply and demand. It's building the right properties for the right people in the right places. Absolutely. And I'm not sure there's much of a joined-up policy sometimes between the councils who make the 106 decisions about what they want to do with that 106 money. Some of them... Yeah, I remember 3 or 4 years ago, Kensington and Chelsea had about 5 billion or something sitting in their 106 account, which they weren't doing anything with. Yeah. And it was just incredibly frustrating to see that sort of money sitting there not being used properly.
Yes. The other knock-on benefit with this as well, of course, is again, we talked about NIMBYism earlier, and that affects us all. We all feel that at times. But what's the community going to be more comfortable with? A developer or a housing association that comes in with these new 30 houses on that estate, and those people occupying that are often from a different part of the country. In where I live, they come from Teesside, West Yorkshire. No issue with that, but they're not local people. Would you rather have that, or would you rather have those houses made available for local people who want to get into the housing ladder? Suddenly you've got a different conversation with people about, do you want housing in your local area? Which is a very positive conversation.
Well, it can be, but of course, if it means selling it at a lower price, you come back to the house price discussion, don't you? And people worry that if house prices are going to be a bit lower because only local people can buy, there's always a balance. I agree, this is not a discussion like you have in Cornish villages where people are worried about rich Londoners buying holiday homes. I agree, it's not that at all. But clearly there needs to be someone to sort of oversee all of that. Okay, well, we'll finish on that in a minute. A couple of other quick things I'd love to ask you about. I mean, obviously one of the big changes in our industry over the last sort of 5 or 6 years has been purple bricks. There's no point in beating about the bush. They've been the dominant player. Do you think what purple bricks is bringing to the market is a good thing, a bad thing? Do you think it's part of the development of the market? And where do you see the market going in terms of estate agency in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, our business benefited from the fact we've got a competitive market, that we could get into it and start winning market share, winning the market and building a business. So I can't deny Purple Bricks that same opportunity. And they did tremendously well. I mean, better than I ever thought they could do. It was their model had been tried quite a few times over the years, but they just did it better on a bigger scale. They're more ambitious and very well executed. One thing we said right from the start, though, for us, it wasn't really a disruptive technology. That's what people kind of think, this new disruption to the market. When you looked at it, the big disruption really was the payment method. That was the difference. But the payment method was not quite what people thought it was. It was like, oh, it's half price and you don't have to pay to the completion. 10 months down there, I'd have sold my house by then. It's not. It was an upfront payment. And lots of people have tried upfront payments before in the market, not very successfully. What Purple Bricks were able to do is make that argument much better, make it more compelling. But on the basis, I think average fee now reading their accounts is about £1,200. I think Purple Bricks charge. They charge up front, get paid on every instruction, of course. Our average fee across most of the country is about £2,500. We only get paid on completion. We only complete on half our instructions.
So actually,
the fee is about broadly the same.
Because interestingly, quite a lot of their business, Purple Bricks, because where the onliners have been successful, and I use the word onliners merely generically to describe those who are, we know that all agents are online, et cetera, but the onliners as we describe them. Certainly Purple Bricks, the majority of their business is in your part of the world. It tends to be in the West, in the North, where the fee they're paying isn't an awful lot less than they would be paying an agent, which is odd.
Yeah. I mean, a big thing I'm into in Parliament, I talk about it a lot, is just fair and level playing fields. I don't mind competition as long as it's fair, it's a level playing field, everybody's playing by the same rules. The concern I probably had at one point with Purple Bricks is how they were marketing themselves. It wasn't clear that the payment schedule or the payment process and was as clear as it should have been. I don't think in terms of some of the advertising, but that's changed now, and I think people understand what the model's about. Do I think new competition is good for our business? Yes, I do actually. I think it keeps us on our toes. The number one thing that makes our business evolve, innovate, ultimately become more successful is competition. It's not regulation. We want to be ahead of the game. We're developing all kinds of new technology in our business. We've got a guy called Dan Rafferty who used to be at Foxtons, did all the software at Foxtons. And we're building a whole new kind of CRM system that's about a productivity suite that's going to take steps out of the process, that's going to make us far more efficient. And so our future, we believe, a typical office that might turn over 400 grand has three members, 3 sales negotiators, 3 lessons negotiators. In the future, we should be able to run that office with 4 people with a similar turnover. That's where we think the industry will go to. And a lot of those kind of evolutions and innovations have come from people like Purple Bricks. You're booking your valuation online, booking a viewing online, negotiating your sale online. All those things can happen through software, and that's what we want to do. I mean, you're working at the sharp end, like I have done. You this crazy system of arranging a viewing of a house. Somebody rings up, says, I want to view Acacia Avenue 12 o'clock tomorrow. You say, right, okay, no problem, I'll come back to you. You ring the vendor, they will say, oh, well, can I do 1 o'clock? You go back to the potential purchaser, they say, I can't do it then. And you spend about 6 phone calls. You can do all that stuff online in a heartbeat. So we need to kind of really look at where we're spending our time and wasting our time that the customer doesn't see benefit from. Always built around the customer, to say what the customer would like, how would they like to do this? Because all those 6 phone calls are a pain in the neck for the customer. Yeah. So we should have a new look at our whole business model, we think, in terms of processes, and take steps out which benefit the consumer and mean we can run our offices far more productively.
I think that's, funnily enough, actually, I met Dan a couple of weeks ago, so I'm well aware of exactly what you're doing, and I think that is exactly the way forward for a lot of people. And I think it's been some of the frustration with a lot of, as I think you're aware, my new business is around viewings and trying to help agents not have to spend too much resource on doing that. One of the frustrations with a lot of prop tech companies is that the estate agents rely on their CRM systems. These are customer relationship management systems. For those who don't understand them, a lot of agents, actually very small agents, don't have them at all, 50% or something supposedly. But for the majority of agents, they say, well, that's fine, but it's got to integrate with our CRM system, the stuff that's going to make it easier. And of course, that's exactly what Dan is doing, is integrating some of the stuff into a bespoke system.
Absolutely.
But a lot of the guys like, Repit or the Zoopla systems, they are all currently rushing to do that, to make themselves open platform, open API. I'm not technically minded, so I'm not going to try and pretend I know what I'm talking about, but they're going to try and make them more integratable for prop tech systems. So, and it's been a very frustrating time, I think, for a lot of agents who just have a succession of prop tech people coming in front of them saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. They've got absolutely snowblind. They don't know which way to turn with it all. Whereas if a CRM system, supplier says, well, actually, we've distilled this down to the best of 10 and they're all on your platform, or they're all on your dashboard, that's going to make life a lot easier. So I absolutely think that's the right way forward. One of the other things that I find through my business Vuber is that there are an increasingly large number, a significant minority of our players are the type of people who would have worked in a hunter's office or a countrywide office or whatever it was, and would have then gone off and started up on their own and opened up an office, have actually gone off and used, because they're on their own, they can afford to use some of these prop tech services. And they are operating from not a back bedroom, that's a bit mean, but they're operating from home because they know their area. They can do that without having the shop front. Do you see the shop front as being a continuing part of the future for agents, or do you think that is debatable?
It's debatable. I mean, we started what we call personal agents back in 2008. As the crisis hit, we were franchising. We'd franchised a few offices. Suddenly, the great financial crash, suddenly our business model was devastated. So we thought, how are we going to do this? So we thought, we'll try personal agents, which is just people working in a certain patch without an office. And we recruited 30 of them very quickly. We had a number were very successful. Probably about a third were very successful. All those went on to open an office.
Right.
So, and not necessarily a high street office, sometimes a kind of service office or an office adjoining the kind of home or whatever. So you do need a kind of workplace still.
Well, I agree with that. That's a slightly different argument because working from home can be very distracting. I know that personally.
Yes.
But to have an office you can go into is important. But what I mean is that the having a high street presence is not necessarily a part of the future.
I agree.
Yeah.
Agree. It's not necessarily not either because high street premises are not as expensive as some people think.
No, it's the people in them that tend to cost
It's
them.
exactly right.
Yeah.
So that's the key. It's a productivity we should be focusing on. So staffing the office is the most expensive thing, just having somebody sat there in case somebody comes in. So that's probably going to change. So we've got all kinds of things going on. The nice thing about running a franchise network is you've got these 200 kind of innovation incubators, all people doing different things. So it says, right, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that. And we want to facilitate that. We want people to work in any way that they want within as long as they treat the customer properly, charge a fair fee. All those things. Your customer service is critical, and customer service is about being effective at selling or letting homes as well. So it's not just about being nice.
Well, I think communication and tech enables that these days.
Sure.
Isn't it?
So we've recruited a big agency up in the northwest, Cumberland, and 7 offices. They're moving towards a hub model. Great. We want to facilitate that, and the technology is absolutely critical to that. I think too often in the past we've looked at our CRM system and software as like electronic filing cabinets, rather than these should be enablers. They enable higher productivity,
and marketing,
absolutely,
everything like
absolutely.
that.
And
People have been in contact with you is what people want. Now, look, we've talked for an awful lot longer than we thought, which has been fantastic. I'm going to end on this. Clearly, we've alluded to a lot of things that seem to require a centralised view, and certainly the affordable housing element and how all these disparate councils and local authorities put together their 106 policies would, to me, be a lot easier if all of them could refer to a sort of housing czar, for want of a better expression. It's a bit of a naff expression, whatever it is. But, I mean, for anybody that wants to give Kevin support for his ideas that he's been discussing about the difference between regulation and beefed up redress, how would people get in touch? You've got a website, haven't you?
kevinhollinrake.org.uk, I think it is.
Okay.
So please contact me. I'd love to hear ideas about how we deal with this stuff. It's none of us are as smart as all of us. So the more ideas we get from the outside, people see this at the sharp end. Most of the things I've talked about today, the stuff you talk about, is because we've been at the sharp end.
Yeah.
We know how it works.
People need to listen to us.
Totally.
Hopefully you'll have more of a voice because you're on the inside, which is great. Well, the insider part. Well, look, Secretary of State, Housing Czar, whatever it is, we'd love. I think most of the people listening to this would love the idea of you being more involved. I know you very kindly came along today, despite the fact that you had quite an important thing going on somewhere else that you would have liked to have changed this for. So I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to come in.
My pleasure.
And I really hope people listen to this and get in touch. Kevin Hollinrake, that's HOLLIN, no G.
That's right.
Hollinrake.
Yes.
.org.uk. Do get in touch with Kevin, and thank you so much for coming in.
Much appreciated. Absolute pleasure.